Here we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, and welcome, Rob Atkinson.
Thank you.
All right, Alberto. Alberto had the idea to invite Rob because credit must be given where it's due, as apparently Columbia University president has not done. Have you seen the news?
I have
No,
not.
Let me put a bit of spice in this live talk. All right, let me read outright from a distinguished colleague at Yale University. Columbia president only has one well-cited publication in her life in Oxford Economic Papers 1994. The paper is lifted almost entirely from a 1992 report co-authored with consultant not credited in the publication. This is wholesale intellectual theft, not subtle plagiarism. And given that it's to do with information, intellectual property, with which Rob and I discussed in the past, I give the word to Alberto.
yes, thank you, Michele. Rob Atkinson is a great friend of mine, and I cherish the relationship we had for several years already. Rob is the founder and president of ITIF, which is one of the world's most important think tank on technology and technology policy. Rob himself is a very distinguished scholar. I mean, there's no time to list all his achievements, but he served in a number of U.S. administration, Clinton, Bush, Biden. I'm not sure you served in the Obama administration,
I did.
Rob, too. Obama as well.
Advisor, yeah.
And he's
And Trump.
at home at the U.S. Congress, where he testifies on issues of the intersection of between technology and public policy. Rob has written recently some very interesting piece. One has to do is called G2 technology. The U.S. and Europe should develop a G2 strategy in technology development. They should join forces to counter China offensive. And also, Joe is a proponent of what I would define, many people define as a NATO free trade. Like the Western countries should develop a free trade areas among themselves and trying to contain China trade offensive, which many times is considered to be too mercantilistic. So we would like to entertain Rob on these two subjects, and I leave Michele to start the discussion.
Well, let's start from the NATO idea. That is, what's the way you see it? So let me warn, but probably Rob already knows. I am not convinced that a trade war is the best thing to do. By the way, the Chinese are preparing for it. They just passed legislation. I don't know if you guys saw the news yesterday, I think, or this morning.
No.
Please go ahead. Tell us about the way you see the issue.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Alberto, Michele. It's great to be with you. Look, I hate it when people, particularly in Europe, America's started a trade war. We didn't start the trade war. The Chinese started the trade war. They started the trade war 20 years ago. Okay, so come on. We are only responding to aggression with trying to protect ourselves and the global trading system. Now, one of the tactics that the Chinese have, and we saw that during COVID, the Australian government had the audacity to come out after COVID and say, we should have a global investigation of the origins of COVID. Well, look, it's pretty clear that the COVID virus came from that lab in Wuhan, and the Chinese didn't want that to happen. So what did they do? They completely cut off exports of minerals and other wine and other things like that from Australia. They tried to cripple them. They did essentially what you would see in the movie The Godfather. And what did we do? Nothing. What did Europe do? Nothing. We said, oh, yeah, that's too bad, Australia. Take your lumps. And so my friend and colleague, Clyde Prestowitz, who's also a close colleague of Alberto, we wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that said it's time for a NATO for trade against China. And when one of us is attacked, we should all stand together and protect them. And so if we had had a NATO for trade and China decided it wanted to completely punish Australia for having the audacity to say, hey, let's have a global investigation of the origins of COVID, we would all work together to punish China economically. And you've seen this over and over again. At one point, they threatened, I don't know if it was Denmark or one of these countries, that for our friends, we have wine. For our enemies, we bring a shotgun. What is that all about? So I think what we have to basically send a clear message that says, hey, China, you cannot use that sort of unilateral intimidation to browbeat and kowtow countries to your will. If you do that, we will stand up collectively together, and so you can't do it.
But isn't this what the WTO is supposed to do? And so, given that we design it mostly, it's a Western idea. Never been particularly sympathetic to it for a variety of reasons, among them WIPO, as you well know. For those that don't know, by the way, we haven't said a word of Italian. Let me say 2 words of Italian, if you don't mind. Signore e signori, è in inglese, come avrete compreso, ed è in inglese, quindi spero che parleremo lentamente. Rob parla molto chiaro, quindi fate uno sforzetto. Back to English. I just start telling people that we're trying to speak as slowly as possible, but we have to use the international language. Now back to WTO and WIPO. We designed that. Why have we designed a system? Look, I totally agree with your evaluation of the various episodes you have mentioned, and not just those. The whole thing about investigation about COVID, I find it annoying, to say the least. I think the Chinese government has been irresponsible and very obstructive, and so on. That's certainly true. And I also agree that, I don't see this in terms of war. I see them in a different way. I see it in the form of countries that are very poor, that want to develop and have a grudge, a long, simmering historical grudge, for good or for bad. But maybe we want to go over colonial stories, but it may not be the case. Tend to behave like that, and they need to be stick and carrot. They need to be brought into line and understand that there is a sense in which bygones are bygones in history, and you just play the game, and you play the game fairly. Otherwise, the other will retract. So I totally agree. But isn't the mistake in WTO, and doesn't your idea imply that if we don't do it within WTO, then we might as well shut it down because it's good for nothing?
2 things. One, bringing any action even when the WTO was working before China joined, and it's not working now, even when the WTO was working, it would take 2, 3, 4 years to resolve an issue like that. So by the time you've even gotten a thing to Geneva to prosecute it, process it, it's the damage is done. You can move on. The offending country, China, can say, oh, we're sorry, we're not going to do that anymore. So in terms of that kind of quick response kind of activity from a NATO for trade, it wouldn't work. The WTO doesn't work anymore. I remember once I co-chaired this U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group for President Obama for the White House. And I remember being over in Beijing, and I was talking to a lead Chinese official at one of their major ministries at lunch. And I said, aren't you worried about the WTO? And he said, we have so many lawyers who understand the WTO rules so in depth, and we know how to do what we want to do without triggering a WTO investigation. So, for example, in the WTO, it is illegal to make market access contingent upon setting up a factory, or even worse, transferring technology. It's illegal. Now, we can say, well, China would then say, okay, well, show us the law. Where do we have it in our statute or our administrative ruling that we force technology transfer? And because it's not in a law or a written statute, administrative rule, you cannot prosecute it. And they know that. That's number one. So most of what they do is not written down in law because they're not a rule of law administrative rule country. So they just do this stuff through dictate through the Communist Party. The second big factor is any company who brings a case against the WTO, who has any presence in the WTO, will wake up the next morning and they'll find a dead horse head in their bed. So there's a famous case about 10, 15 years ago when the EU Trade Commissioner wanted to bring a case against Huawei. He was all set to go. I mean, Huawei, here's a company that's $78 billion in subsidies. And they had every right to bring a case. And, a couple of weeks later, he silently retracted it. Why did he do that? Because the Chinese government went to Ericsson and they went to Nokia, the two big telecom players, and they said, if you bring this case, you will never sell another piece of telecom equipment in China. Now, Ericsson and Nokia being, short-term capitalists, as they are, should be probably, they said, holy shit, no way, we can't do that. And so they went to the EU and they said, don't bring the case. The EU didn't bring the case. It's why you see almost zero cases that the US government will bring against China where there's an involvement of a US company. That has
Again, I totally agree. But then that has to do with two things. One would be a bit philosophical, but it would be worth investigating and thinking a bit, which is the long established and kept views that certainly a liberal view, liberal in the European sense, not in the American sense, that matters have to be solved through a court of law and through procedure, that there is a way of solving matter by letting the judicial system go through. Wrong, but that requires a rethinking of a variety of things. But again, so it's WTO that we screwed up. We designed whoever designed WTO, whoever wrote the rules was dreaming, was thinking that everybody else would have played. Well, honestly, I'm not going to start. American companies and United States have done their part. Everybody's done their part. The Chinese are just first by, a long distance over everybody. But one step of the thing that I want to make clear, Rob, of your proposal is, let's get rid of WTO. Let's just say out loud, ladies and gentlemen, this thing ain't there anymore. Do you agree with me that that's?
I totally agree with you.
That's a step.
What I think we have to do is we have to originally the proposal after World War II, as you recall, we had the big Bretton Woods meeting. We created the IMF. We created the World Trade, we created the IMF. We created the World Bank, and we created or tried to create the International Trade Organization. If you go back and read what that was all about, it was about countries who were committed to the rule of law and all this stuff. We didn't create it. The U.S. vetoed it. What we need to do is we need to create a Western trade organization or market-based trade organization or whatever you want to call it. And it should be Europe, Japan, the U.S., the Commonwealth countries, and a few other countries who are willing to obey the rules. And if you're in that club, you have to comply with free trade and all the other things that make the global system work. The problem is right now we have no leverage against China because we're stuck in the WTO, and it's very hard to bring actions against them because it's seen as you have to have rules that apply to everybody, most favored nation and the like. So I think it's time to create a new organization. You can let the WTO continue to exist. It just won't mean very much. But I think it's time for a new trade organization for fair traders.
I can go on, but Alberto.
So you cannot call me in because I happen to agree with Rob on this issue.
All right. Well, given that you guys agree, you can share an answer to this. Very good. What's the time horizon you're putting into this project? And literally, whom do you think will agree to such a move? Because let's throw away. How can I say? I don't want to sound too nasty. High principle statements that of the goods versus the bads, and we were all nice and they were all nasty and things like that, right? We're all grown up. We all have passed 18, all three of us, unfortunately, more than once. And so we know in strictly strategic terms, whom do you think will get in, and what's the time horizon which you're thinking at something like that?
Well, first of all, the only way this will happen is the U.S. has to lead. Everybody else is afraid of going first because they know what kind of retaliation they will get from China. It's just clear. The U.S., as we've led in the global world and for freedom and democracy, we have to take up that mantle. There's no way we're going to do that right now. The Biden administration is an anti-trade administration. They don't fundamentally, they want to roll back globalization, not expand it. You just see that day after day. They would love to live in an autarkic world. And the Trump administration is probably, if there were to be another Trump administration, would be pretty much exactly the same. So I'm not prognosticating. I'm hoping. I'm advocating. But I think it would be later in this decade where we could have an administration who might see the necessity of doing that. Then the question is, well, who would be willing to come along with us? I think the Japanese would be willing to do that. I think the Brits would be willing to do that. The real key uncertainty in this whole debate for the entire world future, the whole issue, boils down to what Europe wants to do. And as it stands, Europe wants to have its cake and eat it too. You know, if you just saw that piece by, I think it's Mr. Draghi, Alberto.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
he's
Mr.
doing this big report now for the commission or for the president on competitors for Europe. Well, good. But he has the gall to say in this piece that the United States and China are co-threats, are equal threats to Europe. This is, I don't even know what to say to that. It's so absurd. And yet, so if Europe ever decides that they really understand what's going on in China and they stop listening to the Germans all the time who just want to sell cars, and Volkswagen just entered into this massive partnership, and they're all, look, the reality is Germany is going to end up with nothing in Europe, in China, nothing. They'll end up with nothing, but they don't seem to realize that. So I think we're not, this is something that's, as think tank people would call, this is what's called the Overton window. In other words, widening the window of what people think is acceptable to even have a conversation about. That's where we are right now.
Yeah, but allow me.
Sure.
This whole argument is all based on the fact they're all stupid.
Who?
That's the point. You seem to be missing. It's a high-minded argument, but it starts from some factual observation that I agree. It bypasses a big fact. The U.S. led all the trade and various GATT rounds. The U.S. And the intellectual leadership. Allow me to be nasty, Rob, because otherwise the discussion is not fun. So I'll get to the point. The U.S. leading class, the U.S. elite, left and right, Republican and Democrat, led the whole process for 40 years. The U.S. opened up to China. The U.S. decided that China was an enemy but a trade partner, and so on and so forth. Now, the same guys that have screwed it up royally for half a century and made every possible mistake and have indicated all the wrong ways of doing it, all of a sudden wake up and says, oh, hell, you know, we screwed it up. Now, no matter, it's the Germans that are stupid. Allow me, I'm not sure. I'm not sure this works this way. And I'm not sure it's the best way to convince partners to come in and say, let's give it another try. I think this requires rethinking the overall thing. Among that, the U.S. has to lead in foreign policy, with the exception of the management of the tent in the Cold War and the North Korea and the Korean intervention, which was the understanding of the risk that Stalin was, we do it to Churchill, let's admit it. The guy had seen it way before everybody else. The U.S. leading class, the U.S. elite, the U.S. intellectual elite should do a little bit of mea culpa and do a bit of reflection and try to think at moving on this one in a more consensual form. Antagonizing the only solid allies, which is the Europeans, and intimidating the Japanese that are already intimidated enough by sitting next to to the dragon, I don't think it's the right strategy, frankly. And finally, you guys are abstracted by the way in which the chain of value around the world is. And I think you both are much more expert than me about input-output structure at the very firm level. Announcing that to China means saying, all right, shut down the value chain. Stock market is going to go to the drain in a way that the 28 crash is going to look small. And I wonder, if you think we are rebuilding a value chain that took about 4 decades to build up in a couple of years, you guys are a bit, how can I say, having some illusion.
So a couple of things. First of all, you're implying things that I'm not at all saying. Number one, you're also implying that I'm part of the elite class who did this, which is, as Alberto knows, is far from reality. I've been complaining about this for 20 years. First of all, the U.S.-led trade structure after World War II was fundamentally not in our interest. And I've written extensively about this, as has my colleague Clyde Prestowitz. We opened up our markets for so many other countries because we didn't want them to go red. And that hurt us way more than any other country. We were always willing to say, okay, we're not going to press you, whatever the other country was, because we don't want you to go red. We want you to stay in the Western democratic orbit. So, hey, have access to our markets. So this was done by the elite class and the leadership in the U.S. You're right, but it wasn't in our interests. It was we were doing it to be magnanimous and help the world. We didn't have to do that. We could have looked out for ourselves, and we didn't. Second point, when you say we're browbeating the Japanese, 100% wrong. The Japanese are begging us, and I've talked to so many Japanese officials. The Japanese are begging us to take leadership on this issue. And Mikhail, the other point is, look, when I say the U.S. has to take leadership, I would be happy to have the Europeans take the lead role. That would be my dream if the Europeans were to stand up, man up, and do this. Reality is they're not going to do it, which is why I said I think the why the U.S. has to lead it. I don't care who leads it. I'd love the Europeans to lead it. I'd love them if they want to work with us hand in hand to do it. But I see no evidence. I mean, when the Trump administration started to put tariffs on some of these products from China, what did Europe do? They took advantage of us. That's what they did. They took advantage of us by intentionally going in and trying to sell their products where we were shut out. That is not the action of an ally. That's not the action of a friend. That's not the action of somebody who sees China as a threat. And to your last point, I couldn't agree more. I don't want to eliminate or cut off the value chains in China. There are China hawks in the U.S. who want to do that. I think they're crazy. We should be selling more semiconductors to China because it's good for us. We should be selling more cars to China. What I want to do is I want to stop, or you can't stop it, I want to reduce their techno-economic predation. That's what we have to do. I mean, if you think that there's going to be chemical companies in Europe in 15 years at this rate, you're wrong. The Chinese are making a massive effort to go after fine chemicals, which is Europe's strength. They're doing the same thing. We've already seen it in steel. We've seen it in solar panels. Airbus in 15 years going to have a much smaller market than they are today because of COMAC. So we have to go after that level of predation. I don't mind China getting rich. I just want them to think of themselves as Ricardians. They're good at some things. We're good at other things. So it's a very different thing. And I really, really irks me when Europeans see this as well as the Americans are doing this on their own. We're not. We want Europe to be a partner, but I don't see a lot of evidence that Europe wants to be a partner here. I think the Germans are wanting to sell as many cars in China as possible. You saw that with Scholz's visit over there. That's not we're going to work.
Yeah, I totally agree, Rob. Just at the time when we are suffering the Russian aggression in Ukraine, also was a very poor taste for Scholz to go over to China with 200 German executives. And he had done the same thing a year and a half ago. It's not that he has done a year ago, not even a year ago he did it. Again, he went over there with 200 executives. This is ridiculous.
Yeah, and the Chinese are arming the Russians.
But the fact is, you know, where you make a mistake, Rob, when you talk about Europe. Europe, in my opinion, does not exist.
It's
There's
27.
no Europe. It's 28, 27 countries with different.
I have to get these two guys into order. Let me tell you guys. If you let them to their own, they're going to declare mercantile war. So I don't know if to go down in history or go down on practicalities, because on both grounds, why I understand your motivation, I totally disagree. First of all, Rob, you seem to be becoming part of those strange guys that haven't read Schumpeter and think that trade is not good for growth. Allow me. No, the US didn't do that out of generosity. It was not only the political thing. The Marshall Plan was the political thing. Trade was in both sides' interest. Trade as a problem.
I have read.
You have read?
On my TikTok, I say I'm a proud Schumpeterian. I think global trade is fantastic. China is not practicing that. And for you to say, so let me finish. For you to say that if we push back against China, if we let them massively subsidize their industries to destroy our industries, that we are being mercantilist, that is not right. I want total free trade with Europe. Total free trade. No more tariffs, nothing. Total free trade. I would love to see that because it would be good. China's never going to do that. And to say pushing back against China is mercantilist is saying that if you hit me with a big giant stick and I punch you back, that I'm being violent.
That's not what I said.
You said we're being mercantilist. You said I'm supporting mercantilism.
No, I'm saying yes. In your argument about what the US did after World War II, you stated that there was no interest, no economic interest.
I know, but you also said that I was being a mercantilist. So
right,
I'm happy to argue with you about the U.S. interest. How was it in our interest, Mikhail, for us to run a trade deficit every single year for 40 years? How is that possibly in our interest? And knowing that we were doing that.
Allow me, I will try to explain you.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, it's very good to run a trade deficit. Everybody wants to, because if you finance it by printing your money that everybody hold as safe value in their vaults, in their central bank reserves, you're essentially borrowing at no cost. Okay, so it's a very good thing. We explain it. Bob Solo was famous for pointing that out first, and I think Bob Solo was absolutely right. There's nothing wrong in running a trade deficit per se, as long as people don't come and cash in on the debt and say, hey, listen, buddy, I have financed this whole thing by buying your public debt. My undergraduate student yesterday presented a paper in which they showed this fantastically well. Fantastically well. I mean, it was unbelievable. The couple of graphs from the 1950s will show you the US trade deficit were financed by countries that exported goods mostly, not very little services, to the US, and buying with the dollar they received in exchange US public debt. Okay, so yes, this was in the enormous interest of American companies, of the American economy, and American citizens. Now, some of them, and here comes the issue, some of them, a fraction of them, were not compensated. And that's the problem, but it's all an internal American problem about welfare state and redistribution. Out of 100 average winners, as in the Trilussa story with the chickens, it's an Italian joke, people in Rome, and that Trilussa, apparently a popular poet, said, you know, when you say on average, each one of us eat a chicken, it's because you eat 2 and I eat 0. Okay, so there was a 20, probably, between 20 and 30% of the workforce, US workforce, that got hurt by this because it implied a substitution of production that were carried out abroad at cheaper cost, lower cost, or even subsidized. It's debatable, right? Look, the German car industry or the Japanese car industry coming into the US in the 70s Was it subsidized? There was debate about that too. The variety of other things, the clothing industry, it was the Europeans coming in first before the Chinese completed the job, and so on. But all that stuff was in the interest and much to the advantage of the average guy in the US economy. Then in the US economy, the internal mechanism of tax and redistribution and welfare provision and blah, blah, blah did not redistribute the gains from trade. But that's a problem the Americans have to, and I have, we economists have written extensively about this. People always forget that in the second welfare theorem, implies that there are lump sum redistribution to work. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We've wrote about this in the 90s. I wrote about this. I talked about this, and I am not a specialist of this. People that were specialists, like my friend Tim Keogh, that worked as a consultant for NAFTA, pointed it out extensively and repeatedly in the early 90s. That the American political system, and don't take it personally. I mean, you're obviously part, but it's an honor. I don't figure, we are also part, Alberto and I, of the Italian elite. It's a fact. I'm not very much part of the American elite because I've done little political activity here, a little bit. We met at Cato, if I'm not wrong. So the point is to understand that to say that back in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, US opened up to trade with European and Japanese and pushed for it was not in its interest. That is a mercantilist point of view. And I'm sorry, it's wrong. It's just wrong. It's factually wrong. The US would have not grown like that. And the other point to understand that it's difficult to solve is, yes, we screwed up with China. They got used and they established for 40 years. I don't believe that pissing on the head of the Germans left and right, like everybody does, okay, is the right way to approach it. Sorry, guys, it's just not the right way to approach it. It's becoming a European sport to piss on the Germans. Now, if we add also the Americans, which have been a bit more careful about that and wiser, we're going to get bad reaction. And don't forget that in the 80s and 90s, the fashion was to piss on the Japanese. We did a lot of damage there. So I would take it easier on this. I would try to figure out step by step how to build consensus on the fact that the Chinese are evidently in a desperate mercantilistic effort to get themselves out of the middle income trap. And that's a big mistake. But I would take an approach that says, you're just doing it wrong. So we're going to react nastily to what you're doing, for example, through Mexico. Sorry. We're trying to react with us. But relax, sit down for a moment and try to think that maybe you also have something to gain by not continuing the trade war with us. That's my view. Sorry for the long speech, but I want to clarify that when I say mercantilist, that's what I mean. And the claiming that opening trade was not in the favor of the US is dramatically wrong. It's honestly very wrong.
Well, I think you're wrong. Let's put it that way. So you think I'm wrong. I think you're completely wrong. Mikhail, this is the argument. I'm well aware of this argument. This is the argument that neoclassical economists make, and they've made it for many. You don't think neoclassical arguments make this
neoclassic is a Marxist expression that means nothing. You got to tell me the theory, the model, and the assumption. You got to tell me.
Let me finish. You gave a long speech.
Yeah, it's okay.
I don't know what you want to call it, conventional economics, whatever you want to call it, even Keynesians. Virtually the main problem we have here is economists should not be involved in this debate because they're free market ideologues, okay, and that put the consumer welfare standard first. Now, if you think about that, if a country like China decides they want to give let's just use a thought experiment. They want to give a $20,000 production subsidy to BYD to sell their electric vehicles in the U.S. Is this in the U.S. interest or not? Economists will say, absolutely. Oh, this is great. The Chinese are subsidizing us. How stupid can they be? And look at all our consumers will get these really cheap cars. Ford, GM, Chrysler, they're out of business. But thank God we've got these really cheap cars. Okay. That's the dynamic. That's what's been going on where we're running $1 trillion trade deficit. That's what's been going on. And maybe as Herb Stein said, maybe something that can't go on forever won't go on, but maybe it will go on forever. Maybe these countries will just continue to give us $1 trillion worth of goods every year, and we don't have to pay. And this would be lovely. Okay. Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is, you mentioned China with the middle income trap. That is the last thing they're worrying about. They're not focused on the middle income trap. Xi Jinping is focused on one and only one thing when it comes to economics and technology, and that's global dominance. They want to have all of the car production. They want to have all the chemical production. They want all the space production. They want all the drug production, all the aerospace production, all the high-speed rail production. That's what they want. Now, I don't want to live in a neoclassical world where we're selling the Chinese waste paper, university student services, and tourism. Like, oh yeah, we isn't this great? We're selling them that, and they're selling us everything else. Because in that world, we have no power. And this is not about, there's a great book by Albert Hirschman. I'm sure you know Albert Hirschman, very famous economist. His very first book was called Trade. I think it was Trade and Power. I wrote a 3-part series about it in a journal in the US called the International Economy Journal. And what the Germans were doing from 1900, it wasn't Hitler necessarily, but 1900 and 1940, was they were practicing power trade. It was totally different than what neoclassical economists thought. They were trying to gain power over countries. That's what's at stake here. And I don't want I do not want China to dominate these global industries. That would be a disaster for the free market, democratic West. Yeah, maybe our consumers have done okay because, hey, I'm getting
for a while
a free car every 2 years. That's essentially what U.S. consumers are getting from not having to run a trade balance. So yeah, I'm doing great. I love all this free stuff at the expense of the U.S. economy and our capabilities.
But you're definitely wrong. I'm sorry, but you're definitely wrong. So first of all, forget about neoclassical economics. This has nothing to do with neoclassical economics. This has to do with accounting. I don't even know what neoclassical economics is. There is economics. There is right economics and bad economics. This is bad economics.
Nope.
Yes.
There's Schumpeterian economics. There's neoclassical economics, and one is
okay.
bad.
Listen, Rob. Listen. One thing I don't like is when they teach me things and then they don't know what they're talking about. Schumpeter was as neoclassical as he gets.
Just because you say you're an economist, I mean,
Rob,
it's like, thank you for bringing down the tablet from the Lord. Okay,
no,
so stop doing that. I don't really care if you're an economist. Let's have a real conversation. Don't pull this. I'm an economist and you're not.
No, I didn't say I am an economist. I react to people saying that is neoclassical economics, that is Schumpeterian economics, because that I find absolutely debatable, not to use a stronger word. Joseph Schumpeter was as neoclassic as it gets, and then a little bit more. And not by chance, he's the one that insisted when he listed his famously 5 type of innovation that trade, opening new market is an innovation. Okay, Schumpeter knew what he was talking about.
Of course he did.
Very good. Very good.
Very good about that.
So,
that's not what we're talking about here.
Very good.
How can you even say that's what we're talking about?
Listen, you're the one that stated that is neoclassical economics, the Schumpeterian economics, and I corrected it, and I am correcting you because that's an incorrect and
being corrected by. Thank you for correcting me. That's so helpful.
Very good. Let's go up. Let's go farther. You made the statement that the American opened up to trade and was not in the interest of the American economy. Now you accept that it was, and you're bypassing the true.
No, I didn't say that.
No. You said it was in the interest of the consumer.
Thank you,
Rob said thank you. The consumer and the firm. Apple.
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely not in the interest of our firm.
Listen, would you let me finish?
When GM is losing to Toyota, that's not in the interest of GM.
It is in the interest of GM because thank you to the competition with Toyota, GM learned to make a little bit better cars. All right, they would be making shitty cars like they were doing in the 70s, where not it be for the competition of the Japanese. You're missing the relevance of competition in all this. I don't know if that's Schumpeterian or neoclassical. I know it works. If you're now assuming that instead it's a lack of competition that makes us innovate, welcome to the world. Let me finish.
Let me finish fair competition. If Japanese companies accessed our market with massive subsidies, which they weren't, but do you think that's fair? And is that good for GM? As opposed to fair competition like we had with
Well,
BMW.
that's your view that they access the market with massive subsidies. It's not their views. If you want,
I'm stipulating this as a thought experiment, Mikhail. I'm thinking it's a thought experiment. Do you think it's good for GM or any American company to have to compete against a competitor that has a closed and protected market in their market and is massively subsidized? Is that good for competition? And is it good for the
answer to that question depends on a lot of factors per se. So I'm not going to answer that hypothetical question because it's not what happened. So
it doesn't matter whether it happened. It's a hypothetical question, which is critical.
No, because I don't want to discuss an hypothetical question.
It's so valuable to competitors, then you're living in a completely different world. Because that's not the economics.
Rob, why
Mikhail.
Why should I go down a discussion that wants to take me in some counterfactual thing instead of
that is exactly what's going on with China today. We're not in some free market nirvana idealistic world. We're in a world where the Chinese are massively subsidizing, protecting, and stealing IP. And the question at hand is that good for competition? Is it good for innovation?
Oh, this is
I'm almost done. And is it good for American companies? And that's what I'd like to know, honestly.
Very good. Now, given that I wasn't done when you decided to interrupt, you will let me finish. All right?
Oh, you're not going to answer. Okay.
The point is that we should, in this debate, leave aside, there's getting a little bit too much rhetoric into this. The bad guys, the movies, it's, it doesn't really work well. Not with the audience we are talking to, which is not very ideological, nor is prone to listen to rhetorical things, the neoclassical economists, the poor. It doesn't work that way. So once we have established that opening up trade in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s was extremely beneficial to the American economy.
No, we have not established that, Michele.
All right. Then you have to. Alberto. Let's go back. Fine. Let's establish the fact.
The point here is China and Europe and the U.S.
So now the new statement is trade in the 50s.
Oh, 60s, come on. Okay, look, I have no desire to debate that with you. It's an irrelevant point.
Hey, listen, it's not my fault.
Why don't we talk about that for the next hour, okay? Who cares? The point is, what do we think about China? That's what I thought this show was about.
No. The facts
You don't want to have that conversation. You want to have a conversation about how bad America is. Okay, let's do that.
The facts count because they allow us to understand what's going on. When I make that statement, Alberto interrupts me and says, no, that's not true. That's not established. Then I'm forced to go back. So we better decide.
We can ignore it because it's not worth having a conversation about. Who cares?
I don't ignore. Fine.
I know you want to talk about it. Okay. Go ahead. It's your show. You can talk about whatever you want. No. I thought we were on this show to talk about China.
Very good. So once we have established, we all agree, once we have established and we have eliminated the rhetorical argument apart, the good Americans, they got into trade to be generous with everybody and blah, 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 which is all bullshit. All right. It's all false. Let's get down to the issue. Let's get down
to the issue. Why don't you just say you don't agree with me, okay? With the nonsense about it's all false, it's all false.
So it's either false or
that would be a nice thing to say.
Is it true or is it false?
How about that? You're wrong.
Okay, so but if I'm wrong, I am allowed to try to explain you what I'm right.
You're not trying to explain it. You're just saying I'm
wrong. Listen, you just keep interrupting me. I can't finish.
You don't have to say you're wrong. You're wrong. I'm an economist.
I am a good humor guy. I am a good humor guy. I am a good humor guy. If you or Alberto interrupt me every second phrase, I start all over again. I have no problem. I'm a very patient person, and I keep going and going and going, repeating the things. Okay. I want to start from the fact that trade has been very good for America. And if America runs a huge trade deficit with the rest of the world, it's America's choice. The Germans, the Italians, the French, the Spanish, even the British are in the same WTO, in the same world the United States is. Absolutely the same. They play by the same rule. And listening to the point of view that you and Alberto are exposing, they're actually weaker with the bad Chinese. Hence, by your logic, they should be running much bigger trade deficit than the US does. And they don't. This should suggest that you may want to think a bit about internal fiscal policy in the United States. internal redistributional policy in the United States, and the role of the dollar worldwide, which would allow maybe to understand why in the same trade war in which the Germans, the French, the Spaniards, the Italian, the Dutch, the Swedish, the English, the Scottish, the Irish are, US runs a gigantic trade deficit for 5 decades almost, and the others don't. Because
No,
in a
Michele,
blame,
the trade deficit of EU with China is ballooning. It's becoming
the
gigantic.
deficits that count are total deficit. The US runs a gigantic trade deficit with the rest of the world. The European Union does not, and does not run it systematically, Alberto. Come on. We're talking
No,
about
we have a
5
400
decades.
billion deficit with China, Michele.
Who gives a fuck?
No, I
We're
do. I do.
You cannot possibly change argument every 2 and 2. If the issue is the trade deficit of the US, the issue is the trade deficit of the US. The US has been running a trade deficit for 5 decades. The other countries have not. They have operated in the same trade war. Okay? Hence, the reason has to be looked somewhere else for the trade deficit of the US. Let's get down to what really matters and throw away all this stuff about economics that it's all wrong, as this argument just proves. And the point is a military one. So you should state it outright. There is a point of view that may be shareable, may not be shareable, that says there are some strategic sectors in which the US wants to have world dominance. All right? That would be a frank discussion about China. It has nothing to do with consumer welfare or not welfare. It has nothing to do with the profits of Apple, okay, and many other American companies whose profits, whose market value would be enormously lower absent China and the Asian market. Okay, it doesn't benefit only the consumers, it's benefited dozens of American companies. Others have lost. It's an internal redistributional issue within US. A part of the US has gained enormously from this, another part has lost. It's an issue of internal US politics and redistribution. Yes, the part that has to do with companies losing is internal to the US, as it is internal to Italy, as it is internal to Germany, as it is internal to France. These type of conflicts in different forms, you find it in every advanced country. Some companies gain, some companies lost. Part of the economy gained, part of the economy lost. It's clear, and it follows from economics, Schumpeterian or not, that you want to call it. It follows from good analysis of what trade implies. But the issue at stake here is not the US trade deficit. It's just, that's just rhetorical smoke. The issue, and it would be the case, we make it explicitly, is military strategic dominance. So let's get to that. All right? Let's throw away all this stuff about economics, which has no relevance whatsoever.
No, Michele, you don't get to frame the discussion like that. I've been saying for 10 years that we Italians will end up as waiters to the Chinese one day, and that will be the jobs available. We will have to waiter them when they come to Italy for travel. I've been saying
that's
just
rhetoric. That's rhetoric.
No, this is happening.
The Chinese have nothing to do. The Italians were declining way before China got into the WTO.
I know, but the deficit, Germany has a ballooning deficit with China as well now. Germany always had a trade surplus. There is no question. The whole world is worried about the incredible subsidy that China is paying to its industrial sector, and to the increasing dominance of China in a number of key strategic sectors. And you deny that, but it's only you denying that. But most people are extremely worried all over the world. Brazil is setting up an anti-dumping investigation. Even Europe has 3 anti-dumping investigations against China. You want to deny that?
I didn't. I did not. I just denied.
Want to deny that?
Alberto, I have been denying the fact that is 2. 1, this idea of shutting down the WTO and inventing the NATO is suicidal. Okay, it's completely suicidal. It would lead to a collapse of our economic system together with the Chinese one, possibly. Because Brazil, the fact that you listed that China has an aggressive policy of exporting and mercantilist, it's out of question. But this was true also for.
Let's talk about that. That's extremely dangerous. That's why we are thinking about what to do to contain
Very
that.
good. You know what you do? You replicate every single action they take. You replicate it yourself. And you decide if that's convenient or not, okay? You want to subsidize the production of electric vehicles? You do. Or maybe you change your policy with as far as electric vehicles is concerned. You stop subsidizing electric vehicles for ideological reason, which kills you want to kill the Chinese industry in electric vehicles, you stop subsidizing the adoption of electric vehicles in US and in Europe.
No, I would impose quotas on Chinese, not just tariffs. I would recommend imposing quotas like we did with the Japanese in the 80s. The Italian automobile industry survived somewhat because we enjoyed the 30 years of quota vis-a-vis Japan. Otherwise, there would be nothing. There's nothing left anyway, but we would have nothing. This is the point of this discussion. So the idea of having a NATO of free trade is an intellectual, stimulating idea to entice a discussion. Obviously, it's very hard to do, but I think that means joining forces to have a countervailing power to resist this increasing mercantilistic, because the Chinese are not increasing their consumption, they're increasing supply enormously. So every year they have an extremely excessive
this whole
supply.
thing is clear. Let's not go back now to square, because I was trying to react to Rob statements that we are very specific on two dimensions. One, that there was some gigantic process of generosity starting in the 50s. Two, that the solution is this let's call it NATO thing you guys have.
That actually isn't the solution, just to be clear. I made two different points. The
Okay.
NATO thing is short run, very strategic, very tactical. What I was talking about is an alternative to the WTO.
Okay.
Two different
I
things.
have no problem with the alternative WTO, because for the very simple reason, I thought better of the WTO before, when you guys were making it. Sorry for the you guys. That's a bit low, below the belt. I know, but I had to have some fun. Discussions are not good if there is no fun. Well, when people in Washington were making it, okay.
Sure.
So I'm all happy to shut it down, among other things. I repeat, but you're not smiling at that, because if we shut down the WTO, we shut down the IPO, which I think is an idiocy.
You don't like IP rights either. So here's one of the big problems that I think we have, and why fundamentally I'm quite pessimistic that we will ever address this problem, because Michael, you may not agree with this point, but you say these statements as if somehow they're new, and the poor idiots like Alberto and I don't understand them. We actually do understand them, or at least I'll speak for myself. I do. I have read them, I've listened to them, I've debated them. I just don't agree with those points. I think it's a complete ideological fantasy world that you're living in. And the reason I'm so pessimistic about anything happening in the US is when you try to have a debate in the US that says, wait a minute, are some industries more important than others? Is economic predation a problem? You get, and those are two different questions, by the way, but they're related, because the Chinese are not trying to destroy our sugar industry. They're not trying to destroy our lumber industry. They're trying to destroy our aerospace industry. And when you bring that up, and then you say, wait a minute, they're using methods that are not market-based, what the vast majority of economists say, well, that's not a problem. Computer chips, potato chips, it doesn't matter. And then they say, wait a minute, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you try to respond to that, you're being a protectionist. So as long as that's the view, which 90% of the economists in the US hold, 95%, we're not going to do anything really. We just aren't. And the same in Europe. I think Europe's probably a little better. Their problems are more that their companies are in bed with the Chinese. A lot more European economists, I think, understand the point I would have than I think the US do. The US is the home of this kind of economic free market neoclassical ideology.
Look, Rob, really, I want to address what you just said.
No.
What you said, well, I mean, so we have to decide. If you keep proposing this argument, you're wrong. You're just factually wrong. Okay?
Well,
So first of all, this thing of this neoclassical economics is honestly Marxist infection. Sorry, you guys hang around communists way too much, and bad communists are bad. They don't even know their philosophy and their economics. Okay, there is no such a thing as neoclassical economics. It's an invention of people that like to put human beings in boxes. So there is nothing ideological. I gave you facts. If you want to discuss the facts, we discuss the fact. But keep repeating that this is just ideology, and I'm saying you guys are protectionists. That's nonsense. I never used the word because I don't care. I don't care. I don't care if the cat is blue or yellow. All I care is that it's the mouse. Okay. Yes. In this, I like Chen Xiaoping. So all this ideological part that the economists, blah, 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 is wrong. As I mentioned to you, distinguished economists, not including myself, that 30 plus years ago at the start of the Clinton administration were pointing out this question. The problem of redistribution of gains from trade has been clear in economics from day one. Okay, we have been insisting on that. What you keep refusing, because you don't ever mention your answer, is recognizing that the redistribution from trade and the effort of this or the other has a lot to do with internal politics. You just refuse to look at the
problem.
The internal politics of the US has created the winners and the losers in a dramatic.
I understand that. You've said that probably 9 times.
I know. Well, let's start from there.
I don't know when you're wrapping up. The second problem with having neoclassical economists run the U.S. First of all, they shouldn't even be running the U.S. They don't have any. They just don't have any intellectual capability of having any insights in this. But the second problem they have is they have this view, and you're expressing it, which is, God, you're an idiot. How can you stupid people think this stuff? Haven't you read economics? Rather than, no, I've read economics. When I got my Ph.D., that's a lot of economics. I've read hundreds of economics books, and it's not that I don't understand it. I think it's wrong. I don't agree with it.
Can you explain what's wrong? Just cite one and tell me what's wrong, because I told you. All right, you guys run the world. It's not the economists. There is no economist that wrote in the Clinton administration. The guys that wrote WTO were policymakers like you. They were not economists. There were no economists in WTO. All the fuck up. I'm sorry. This is becoming a bit funny now because you keep repeating this manga. It's like being in the Communist Party meeting. It's all the neoclassical economists, bad guys. It's like being in Cambridge. They were all spies for the KGB. All right, fine. I'm used to it. You know, I actually enjoy it. I've done conversation like this with communists repeating your things for decades now.
Alberto,
Can you point out?
Did you know that I'm a communist?
Well, no, I didn't know.
I didn't tell you that. I'm sorry. I run a little Leninist cell. Really wanted to let
go back to the point.
If you keep repeating their argument, I pay back with this. You see, that's the point. That's what you say we should do with China. If China uses some arguments, we have to use the same argument. That's what I'm doing. You keep repeating that economists are neoclassical, that they are stupid, they don't know what they're doing. Very good. Point out a mistake.
No, but this is off. I mean, this is a theoretical.
I totally agree that it's off, but I keep bringing the facts, and you guys are bypassing the facts.
How do we resist and how do we face China's industrial aggression?
Good. You put tariffs.
And quotas.
You put quotas when they're necessary. Can you speak about tariffs?
To do that is better if EU and USA do it in coordination.
It's an hour that I keep saying, get down to the practical instead of preaching NATO. Stop telling the other that they're stupid, that they're traitors, that the German are against. No, let me finish. Let's see if you answered what I said 50 minutes ago. You got to stop having this attitude that everybody's an idiot. You have to stop having this attitude that it's the US being generous. You have to stop having this attitude the US should lead. The US led. It's 70 years that it leads, and it screwed up. And it screwed up. Who screwed up was Washington. The leading class in Washington, the consultants in Washington, the guys that made up the various administrations, they screwed up. Nobody. The Washington consensus was not an idea of neoclassical economics, whatever that is. The Washington consensus was a product of the State Department, of the people putting people in charge of the World Bank, and so on and so forth. I never nominated the bosses of the World Bank. Obama did. Nixon did. Carter did. all right, and so on and so forth. Bush did. That's what the Washington Consensus is. Let's not to get confused about this.
Okay, let's
is
go down to
so.
practical.
If we want to go down to block China mercantile expansion, for example, we have to go over to Mexico and say, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to revise NAFTA.
Alberto,
No.
I don't know what timing you have. I unfortunately only have a couple more minutes. So
Yeah. No, I think yeah, we are over. It's past the hour. The fact is, saying NATO means the US and EU should possibly coordinate their tariff quota and investment containment objectives. This is what NATO is all about. Because if the US does it alone, it's not enough.
absolutely.
This is what it means.
You better
tell you more.
You better convince the Europeans that there is something in it for it. For example, let me give you a quick example. You know what the Europeans will tell you? Very good. You guys have got a fight going on with China. You want to limit their military capabilities. Understandable. It may be in our interest too. It may not be. It depends on the evaluation we give of China foreign policy. Very good. But you know what? You got this aggressive Amazon, Facebook. I'm not saying that I agree, but that's what the Europeans will say. Facebook, Google, what else there? Microsoft, Apple, all sitting in Ireland, destroying our economy. What are you going to do to restrain that?
Building those companies that help Europe, by the way, anytime you want to.
What's sorry?
You can thank us anytime you would like for building the world's greatest digital economy, and you're getting to use it largely.
There you go. You see, that's the usual attitude. You guys got it wrong on that. Because what I'm just telling you is realism. Instead of preaching the Europeans and asking them to thank, you should, if you want them to follow, you should prepare for what they're going to tell you.
I actually know what they're going to tell us. So thank you. Alberto, I unfortunately do have to run. I have another.
Ciao, Rob. Thank you very much.
All righty.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Mi sa che sono scappati tutti e due. Well, I don't see any reason to add anything. I think it's all quite clear. All right. Bye-bye.